Hello and welcome to Kitchen Table Talks. My name is Toni Austin Allen and I am here with Dr. Roy Austin, author of Definitions for Living, a book dedicated to helping you live more effectively and happily, both personally and in your relationships with others. A number of years ago, Dr. Austin compiled numerous articles which he had written to assist his clients into what is now his book, Definitions for Living, making sense of words and ideas that define our lives. Recently, he and I began sitting at our kitchen table and talking about his book, and we became excited about the possibility of sharing our conversations with others who might benefit from them. The podcast you are about to listen to are the product of the recordings we began making of our conversations. We have discussed the book chapter by chapter and have produced this series of podcasts to accompany the printed version of the book, which is now available as an ebook on various publishing websites. Although we believe you will benefit greatly from the podcasts themselves, you will get the most out of them by purchasing the book, reading each chapter prior to listening to the podcast, and having it available to follow along with our conversations. The ebook is available on Amazon Kindle, Barnes & Noble, Scribe, Booktopia, Apple Books, Layman's, and Adlibris. We hope you enjoy our talks at our kitchen table as much as we have, and that your life will be greatly enriched by having shared our conversations with us. All right, we're here at chapter 20, Principles for Making Rules. And you talk about that in civilized society that we really do need rules and regulations. And as much as people think we don't, it's imperative. And can you just give people an idea of why that is?
Absolutely. As I mentioned in my introduction page, rules can be called by a lot of different things like laws or requirements or expectations. So it can go by any number of words depending on the context and the setting, whether it's in business or it's legal or personal or family situations. But we are social beings and we have to interact with each other, and there are certain amounts of controls that we have to have on our own and other people's behavior for us to be able to interact well, or we would not be able to have what we call civilization or societies. It would be chaotic and everybody would just do whatever they think is appropriate in their own minds, and there would be no sense of order or organization, and there would be no opportunity to actually socialize with other people.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people who have trouble with the word rules, or even coming into creating contracts with people, is probably because in their past, rules were done so badly that they think that rules are a bad thing.
That is very, very true. And in my practice over the years, I found that problem exists in all walks of life. Whether it's in business, I found that bosses and companies and organizations, they very often do terrible jobs of setting rules by which to operate in a business organization. And it really gets complicated and deteriorates into power struggles, which is what rules are designed to prevent, and we'll talk about that more later. And also, of course, in families, in personal one-to-one relationships, in other organizations such as churches or social groups, or communities, such as, we have these community rules. So in all organizations, I have found that people do not typically do a very good job of rule making, and that's why I came up with this short but very important chapter on principles for making rules. And I think most of the mistakes are made out of ignorance. They just don't know how to do it, or they know how to do it partially well, but they leave out certain principles because they're not aware of them. And sometimes people do not make rules well because it holds everybody accountable, including the rule maker. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people, particularly anxiety-ridden people, people who are afraid of rejection or afraid of not being liked, if they enforce rules appropriately, or what we call control freak type people who just want total obedience, and they want to be able to use all of their options to get people to do what they want them to do, such as intimidation, threats, manipulation. And so that they want the power to use power tools to get what they want. And in good rulemaking, you don't do that. And so control freaks don't like to be limited by doing it correctly. But most of the time, the mistakes are just made out of ignorance and lack of education.
And then there's the other side of the coin, because some people don't like rules because they don't want to be held accountable to follow them.
Exactly. They don't want you to, and I notice this about teenagers a lot through my practice, is that they don't want their parents to do rules correctly because that doesn't give them any wiggle room to work around parental rules. And so they look for chinks in the armor, so to speak, of how they can break the rules or bend the rules and get by with it because their parents are not doing the rules well. And so they use that to their advantage. But that's true in all societies, not just teenagers.
Yeah. And just thinking about parents and their children, especially with teenagers, but even starting with 2-year-olds, that's where we could start very early. I wish I had known all of this along the way, to have realized I'm okay for saying no, because that's what a lot of people have problems with saying no.
And since you mentioned that, Tony, it's a good point to make, is that there has been in recent years, the last few decades, the making of rules which imply the idea that there are certain behaviors that are not acceptable. But there's been a branch of parental psychology that I think has been a terrible mistake. And that is, you never want to say no to your child. It might warp their little personalities or make them feel inferior or hurt their self-esteem. And so there's been that pop psychology school that says don't ever say no to your child. So saying no to them, you say, well, it'll make them cry, or it will disappoint them, or it'll hurt their feelings and it'll hurt their little self-esteems. And so a lot of well-meaning but ignorant parents have picked up on that theme of kowtowing to their children and not setting rules for that very erroneous concept, is that it might warp the personality of the child. So a lot of parents who grew up in that pop psychology a decade or two also have difficulty making rules for that very reason.
Well, let's go on and start talking about the principles. And there are quite a number of them, and they're so helpful. So why don't I read them, and then you can expound on them?
Absolutely.
Okay. Number 1, a rule is made primarily for obedience. It is intended through some form of positive or negative reinforcement to coerce people to do something they do not wish to do voluntarily. Thus, when you make a rule for someone and enforce the consequences when they do not obey you, expect to sacrifice a sense of closeness or intimacy between yourself and the other person, at least for the moment. However, well-made rational rules can be a positive factor in a relationship when a solid foundation of respect and trust has already been established. Although others may not be pleased with your rules, at least they know what you require of them and can feel a sense of security about the nature of the relationship. And I like that one sentence a lot where it says about they can be a solid foundation of respect and trust that has already, it can be a positive factor in a relationship when a solid foundation of respect and trust has already been established.
And that is an important statement. The overall quality of the relationship is a very important factor, so that whether it's in a work environment or in a family situation, where the other person for whom you're making the rule knows that you care about them, that you respect them, and that also they have some responsibility in the relationship to carry out their part of the load, whether it's to get to work on time or to do their homework or whatever it is you're talking about. But it's also they have to know that you're a good person and that you care about them, and that you're not just being a slave driver and a control freak. And we'll get to that in just a little bit in the next part about rationale. But if you already have a well-established, good working relationship and they trust you and they respect you, then making rules for people is a whole lot easier, and getting them to follow those rules is also a whole lot easier.
It sounds like this part of the equation might pair well with the chapter on how to make demands.
Yes, they're very closely related. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anything more on this rule being made for obedience?
Well, I think that it's important to note, as in the early part of that paragraph, that it is for obedience, and a lot of people feel guilty about that. Mm-hmm. Is that, it makes them feel like, here again, a slave driver or a control freak, but that's not true across the board. That when you make a rule for someone that you're being a control freak or you're being mean or cruel, and that you shouldn't try to make people do something. So they have that guilt, that unrealistic guilt, but also they have the fear, is that if I make a rule for someone, if I have an expectation of them or a demand on them, then that will damage our relationship. They may not like me. They may get mad at me, and I feel anxious about that. Is that it interrupts that closeness and intimacy between us, and it may hurt our relationship, and I don't want to do that. And so they don't have good boundaries, so to speak, and they don't have those requirements because they don't want the other person to reject them.
It reminds me, the whole time you were talking just then, I was thinking about the old TV sitcom of The Odd Couple. And they had such completely different ways of living, and they were always in a power struggle, but they weren't willing to sit down and talk about, these are some things I need, these are some things you need, and working it out.
For that very reason.
Yeah.
That's right, because they value the relationships staying together so much that they would sacrifice quality of the relationship.
Wow. That's very interesting. All right, let's go on to number 2, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
A good rule has a rationale. It is beneficial to the person making the rule and or the person for whom the rule is made, without being abusive or demeaning to either of them. It is not made arbitrarily just to prove your power and authority over someone or to selfishly force someone to please you all the time. When presenting a rule, be sure to clearly explain the rationale behind it.
And a lot of people don't do this either because they don't know to, or they haven't thought it through themselves. They're just making rules that were passed down to them from generation to generation, or they don't want to have to explain the rationale because the rationale, if they put it into words, is that I'm making this rule for you to please me, and I don't care whether it does you any benefit or not. And so sometimes the rationale is very, very selfish, and if they put that into words, it's going to sound really, really bad.
Yes, and that's where you get some reactions, like when a child will say to their father, "But why? Why do you need me to do this? Because I'm your father, or because I said so."
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the reason, because they haven't thought through what the rationale is, and it's not a healthy rationale. It's just, I want you to do this because it makes my life easier, it pleases me, it causes less work for me, it gives me some benefit, and I don't want to tell you that because it doesn't sound good coming out. But hopefully the rationale will be that it benefits both of us in some positive way. And if you can explain that to the person for whom you're making the rules, then you're more likely to get willing obedience and not resentful, angry obedience tinted or tainted with rebellion.
Well, and if you explain it even to a child, even if it is something that I need this, such as, I need you to be quiet. Why? Because I said so. Instead of that, you could say, because I'm really tired and my patience is thin and I need a little time right now, and then later we'll deal with this.
Yes, that's a great example.
Just take a few seconds more to explain rationally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a good example.
All right, number 3. A good rule is specifically and behaviorally stated. It tells people what you expect them to do rather than how you want them to think, feel, or be. As an employer, for instance, you may require loyalty and dedication from your workers, but not explain to them exactly how you plan to measure those characteristics. As a parent, you may tell them exactly how you plan to measure those characteristics. As a parent, you may tell your child to behave while I'm gone next door, or I expect you to do your best in school. As an adult partner, you may insist on total openness from your mate. Such vague demands only confuse other people and set the stage for arguments over whether they have been fulfilled. And I guess when they're saying these things, they think, because they're thinking it through their brain, that that's clear. But if you put the shoe on the other foot.
Well, sometimes it's not even clear to the person who's using those words.
Really?
They haven't thought it through either. And I've asked a lot of people, this has been proven to me in my practice, I've asked a lot of people when we are discussing this particular thing, or they are discussing some trouble they're having with an employee or a neighbor or a family member or a child, and I will ask them, when I'm helping them learn how to make rules, when they use these vague descriptors of behavior, and I ask them, can you give me some examples of that, of how that would be measured? They can't do it. They do not know how to put that into words. They're just using phrases and words that they have picked up from their family or their culture, and they've never given it a second thought about the lack of specificity. It's not behaviorally stated, and so it's sort of like, you need to be nice, telling a child you need to be nice to other kids, or you need, and so what does nice mean? And when you ask a parent, would you describe that in behavioral terms so that your child can understand it? They can't do it.
Right.
They never thought it through.
Well, just because I want to make sure we're real clear on this, let's take a couple of these And could you then put them in words that would be more specific, such as a parent telling a child to behave while I'm gone next door? Could you take that and make it more specific?
Yes. Now, specificity is not only difficult in our language, but it also requires more thought, as we've been talking about, but it also requires more words and more examples. So behave is a catch-all term, but when you explain to a child what that means, then you may have to say, well, what I mean is that you don't fight with each other if you have siblings. I don't want you to get into arguments and hit each other. I want you to stay in the house and not leave the house while I'm gone, because you might get lost in the neighborhood or you might get hurt. So I want you to stay in the house. I want you to clean up after yourself if you make a sandwich. I don't want you to leave dirty dishes in the sink. So you have to give specific examples which require a lot of measurable, doable behaviors, and that's a complicated process. And it's so much easier just have a quickie, y'all behave while I'm gone, and as you walk out the door.
And that's probably just going to go right over their heads, and then they're going to start fighting.
Well, yeah.
Or, I expect you to do your best in school. The word best already is incredibly vague. And so just give maybe 2 or 3 examples of how to say that better.
I've always struggled with that myself because best is so open to interpretation. It's hard to find an example of that because it is really not measurable.
Right.
So you really can't find an example of do your best because best can't be measured. So that's a dead-end street to begin with. I don't know how you would explain to a child to do your best or anybody else because it's not measurable. So you can't put measurable terms to an unmeasurable word.
So then you have to go into about studying or listening well to your teachers, or, it gets complicated, doesn't it?
It's really complicated. It's a catch-all term. And the child is left just scratching their head. Same thing about like in the business example I gave, I need you to be loyal. We're looking for loyal employees. Well, what does that mean? Basically, that means, number one, do as you're told, and stay here and work for us as long as we want you to. Don't go out and get another job. So when you really put it down to specifics, it gets pretty hard to describe. But a lot of companies will give these catch-all terms. We expect loyalty from our employees, which means stay with us as long as unless we decide to fire you.
But so you're giving all these reasons why these statements are not good, but at the same time you're saying a good rule is specifically and behaviorally stated. So what I'm hearing is that unless there is a way to state it clearly, don't use it.
Don't use the word.
Got it.
But it's so much easier to use these catch-all terms and not do your homework when you're making rules.
That's why people don't do it, because they're lazy and they don't want to have to be specific. It's too much work.
But dedication couldn't it be rephrased to, we expect you to be on time, to complete your projects on time.
If you can break it down in those times, but if you're able to break it down, you don't need the word dedication.
Right.
Just tell them what you want them to do.
Right.
And makes it a whole lot easier. Get to work on time.
Right.
And if you don't, I'll dock your pay or you're fired.
Right.
It's that simple. So you don't need the word dedication because number one, it's a useless word, and number two, it's not measurable.
Got it.
So just don't use it.
All right, number 4. A rule should include the amount of time allowed for its obedience. Without a time frame, you will not know when to determine whether the rule has been obeyed or when you carry out the consequences. You need to avoid phrases like, "You must do this on a regular basis," "I must have this done as soon as possible," "Don't be gone too long or I'll come looking for you." Give specific dates and times so other people will know exactly when you are going to hold them accountable for following your instructions. Do not leave the time frame open to interpretation. And I tell you what, you add this obedience, this obey, these words, consequences, and grown-ups are going to get very belligerent. So, but if you can you soften it by saying, I need this project done by Monday at 6:30.
Well, I don't know if we can use the word soften it or not, but I don't think it's using it in a hard sort of a way, being opposite of soft. If you just tell them that very simply, I need this project done within the next month. And we're going to have a checkup time in 2 weeks to see how you're doing, and then you have 2 more weeks to finish the project. So just giving the time frame is neither soft nor hard. It's just realistic and it's respectful.
I can see this working really well in a work situation where you have a boss or manager with an employee. There's a ranking here. And I can see it with a parent and a child or teenager because you're teaching them something. But in a couple, that gets tricky because I can see how one person in the relationship would think, that's kind of controlling, and I'm sure that you've experienced this with relationships in your therapy. Isn't that a little tricky to do this in a more personal relationship?
Not really. Here again, you referred back to appropriately back to the chapter on how to make demands. It's exactly the same thing. It's another word for requirements. And we all have not only the right, but the obligation to what we call set boundaries on what behaviors we are and are not willing to tolerate, or what behaviors we want from the other person, and they have the same right and obligation to tell us. So all relationships have to have rules and regulations to them, have boundaries to them, or you have no way of knowing and measuring whether it's going to be a workable and quality and happy relationship. So it's like when you get into a relationship with someone, you have the right and thus the obligation to share it with the other person, to say, I'm not going to be in a relationship with you if you do drugs. That's a requirement of mine. And so the other person might come back and say, well, you can't do that. You can't tell me what to do. I can do anything I want to do. You say, well, that is true. You can, but you just can't have a relationship with me at the same time, because I grew up in a home where drugs were used, and I have friends where drugs were used, and I know the consequences of that, and I'm not willing to live in that kind of environment. So those are equals, as you were pointing out, in a personal one-to-one relationship, but you have to set boundaries on it, or you don't know, you cannot know whether you are going to have a good relationship with that person, or it's going to be a chaotic, abusive, unloving, and uncaring relationship. A healthy relationship requires rules and regulations for it to work well. That's what makes it healthy.
Even if they're, it could be even something like, if that person is going through a hard time and just continues to go through a hard time, could you go to them and say, I know you're going through a hard time, but I am feeling lonely. I'm feeling disconnected, and I need you to start working on this because I can't handle this much longer.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
You could put some specific times and...
Absolutely. Or someone who is a spendthrift or irresponsible with money. And you have the right to say, look, this is our money. We're living together. We're sharing expenses and incomes, if that's indeed what the situation is. And you have to say, and I'm not going to be in a relationship with someone who runs up a $50,000 credit card bill. We have to declare bankruptcy and lose our home and the college and the kids' college funds. So the rule in this house is that we pay off the credit cards every month and not build them up. Otherwise, I'm not going to be in a relationship with someone like that. So that is a rule, it's a requirement, and it's germane and necessary for the health of the relationship.
That makes sense. Number 5, a rule should include the positive or negative consequences related to its obedience or lack of obedience. Stated positively, you would tell others what you will do for them if they obey you. Stated negatively, you would tell them what you will do to them or not do for them if they disobey. Remember, consequences are the part of the rule that make it a rule in the first place. They are what give a rule its clout. Without them, there is little incentive for anyone to obey you. And I would expect that this is a biggie.
It is a big one. And this is where I found it particularly in personal relationships and in parenting relationships. It's usually done a bit better in business. Like if you don't come to work on time, you'll be docked.
Right.
Or you won't be able to work here anymore. So they're a little bit more specific. But in a lot of situations, the rule would be made, and they're called expectations, unwritten rules type things like that, and which are really bad. But they don't come up with consequences that go along with it. And I've asked many people, well, if this person doesn't do that, or if this child doesn't do that, what are the consequences? And they'll say, oh, I just scream at them or holler at them, and or I keep nagging them to do it, or make empty threats, this kind of thing. They say, well, I never really thought about making the consequences. I assumed that if I just made the rule, they were going to follow it, and there wouldn't be any problem. But remember, the very first chapter, the very first paragraph in this, it's for obedience. A rule is to get someone, or at least to try to motivate someone to do something they do not want to do. If they want to do it, then you don't have to make a rule about it. It's very, very simple. So if you're going to make a rule, then you're assuming or knowing that the other person does not want to do this thing that you're wanting them to do in the first place. And so for you just to make a rule and then expect them to follow the rule just because you want them to is stupid. It's irrational. You expect them to say no. So that's why consequences are necessary, because you're going to get resistance. If they don't want to do it, then there has to be an incentive for them to do it, either a reward or punishment, so to speak. And so a lot of people just think that, that a rule should stand on its own 2 feet. If I make the rule, they'll obey me. And that just makes no sense whatsoever.
And I guess it kind of depends on the person. I was very motivated by positive consequences. I loved winning prizes in piano, or getting to go to the toy store after a competition or something if I worked real hard.
Mm-hmm.
That I just was always, and still am, motivated by positive consequences. But I from teaching, I know that not everybody is. But it seems like a positive consequence would be a good way to start.
Well, it's the ideal way to start and to stay with.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably why you're still motivated by positive consequences, because that's what you grew up with. If you grow up with negative consequences, a lot of punishment, if you don't follow the rule, I'm going to beat your behind.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you get accustomed to being motivated by by negative consequences, because you did not grow up with rewards.
Yeah.
You grew up with punishment. So you really basically are motivated by what you grew up experiencing.
Fascinating, because I will always remember this. One of the first times the first time I can remember being motivated by positive consequences was I was 8, and I know the age. And I didn't want to brush my teeth. I didn't want to brush my hair. I didn't want to make my bed. I didn't want to do anything. So Mom made a little book for me. And so if I brushed for every time I brushed my teeth, I got a point. For every time I brushed my hair, I got a point. For every time I made my bed, I got 2 points. And it was several things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end, if she said, you do this for, 20 days, she gave me a choice. I could have an art kit, or I could have $15. This was back in the 60s, maybe 70. Or I could go out for pizza, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved that. I thought, this is the greatest thing ever.
It's a great example.
And I worked so hard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great example. So you get used to responding well to positive consequences, because you know what that's like, and it's very pleasurable.
Yes.
But if you don't have that as a child, the only consequences are if you don't follow the rules, you get punished. Well, then that's what you're usually motivated by as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And that's why there's so many people in jails right now. Because they're only motivated by negative consequences.
Yep. Okay. I believe we're on number 7. You should be able to measure for yourself whether your rule has been obeyed. It should not require verification by the one for whom the rule is made. Having to ask people if they have followed your rule sets them up to lie to you, or at least to engage in a power struggle with you. Oh, yeah. I can say, did you do what I told you to do? Oh, yeah, huh?
Uh-huh. Right. I'll give you a good example there that we've talked about before. I had a client many years ago who made a rule that her child was supposed to go to church on Sunday morning. And this teenage kid got to the point where he could say no, and he said, I'm not going to church. Mm-hmm. And so the mother said, well, if you don't go to church with us, then while we're at church, you have to clean the house. You have to vacuum the house and wash the dishes and all that. That's your punishment for not going to church. And so they went to church and came back, and he had not vacuumed the floor, and he had not washed the dish. He had not done anything, and then she was stuck.
Yeah.
Because he had beat her at her own game, because she was trying to get him to punish himself for not following the rules, and that's immediately can be seen as just dumb.
And then you've got to have another punishment, another consequences for that.
Absolutely, and so it gets into this power struggle type thing. And
Yeah.
that's like saying, I love to tell the story when I'm training how to make rules in this area about someone who robs a 7-Eleven store. And so he is captured, arrested, taken before the judge, and the judge said, I understand you robbed a 7-Eleven store. And he says, oh, yeah, they caught me at it. And they said, well, you need to go put yourself in jail now. There's a jail cell down at the end of the hall here, and I think you ought to spend 2 years in jail for that. And the guy says, "Oh, you going to make me do that?" I said, "No, I expect you to put yourself in jail. Here are the keys, and lock yourself in and throw the keys away for a couple of years, and we'll let you out in a couple of years." Wait, no one's going to do that. He's going to walk out the door and go rob another
7-Eleven.
7-Eleven store. And so this is a very important principle: is that you better be able to know yourself, and that they've broken the rule, and you have to. Then it moves into this other one. Is that you have to be willing to carry out the consequence yourself and not expect the other person to do it. And we'll get to that one in a minute as well.
So number 8 is the consequence should not create undue difficulties for you. If you make the consequences so severe that you cause yourself emotional or physical hardships, you can find them impossible or too stressful to carry out.
Oh yeah, a favorite example of that here again with parents is that teenage daughter comes home an hour after curfew, and so the father says, "Well, you're grounded for a month." Well, after about 3 or 4 days, that doesn't work so well, and so the father drops it and says, "Oh well, no, I hope you've learned your lesson, and that's okay."
And then also that means that the parents have to stay home to enforce that she's not going out.
You make it too difficult on yourself, and that is true. And or an employer may have a valuable employee that they need to be able to carry out their business well, like an engineer that they depend on, and they say, well, if you don't get this done, you're fired, but they can't do without him.
Right.
And so they back off of the consequence because it costs them too much. So those are sort of extreme examples, but it's done every day. So if it's something that's too hard to do, you won't carry out the consequence.
Absolutely. All right, now we're getting into enforcing the consequences. Number 9, the consequences must be enforceable. They must be stated in actions you will perform if the other person chooses to not obey you. There are 4 categories of consequences within your control. A, physical action against another person. And instead of me reading this, why don't I just let you kind of summarize this?
Yes. Here again, I mentioned this first one because it has always been a very commonly used consequence, and that is physical actions such as spanking or hitting or slapping or some other form of physical abuse or action. And so it's a very common thing.
All the way to corporal punishment, killing somebody for
capital punishment.
Capital punishment.
Yeah, or slave owners, whipping their slaves to keep them in line and this kind of a thing. So I list it only as an option. I'm not recommending it. That's not the point of listing it here in the chapter, of saying this is something you ought to do, because particularly in today's world, thankfully, there are laws to protect people from abuse. And so if anyone is going to use either corporal or physical punishment, they need to be able to check with the law or with whoever authorities have some influence there to see if it is permissible and acceptable and not abusive behavior. And I think that was long overdue because a lot of people, employees and children, or spouses, have been severely abused for thousands of years because of the lack of laws that to protect people. So I'm not saying I recommend it. I'm saying it's one of the options that people have used through the centuries to control other people's behavior.
And if you really look at that, the reason a lot of people use physical punishment, let's say particularly with children, I mean, I think there is abusive behavior obviously in all ages, but particularly with children, like spanking, it's probably because of their ignorance, or that's how they were punished. But their ignorance leads, they might be making an irrational rule. Do as I say. The child doesn't understand it. They don't do it. The parent has no idea what to do at that point. They're stuck, so they hit them. Mm-hmm. And so if you go back and learn these earlier tactics, these earlier skills, then you don't have to resort to something like that.
That is true. And also the reason corporal punishment has been used so much in schools as well as home and in personal relationship is that, number one, it's quick and very easy to do in most cases, as long as you're more powerful than the person you're hitting. But also it's very effective. Mm-hmm. People do respond to pain.
Yes.
They don't like to hurt, and they don't like to be hit in the nose.
Yeah.
Or slapped around. And so it's very effective to get obedience. So that those are two other reasons that people do, and not just because that's what they grew up with, but because it's quick and it's effective, and you don't have to think through the process of using the other three options like you mentioned.
Right, and especially if there's a person who's quick to anger, that's going to be their first go-to.
Yeah, they don't have to be responsible with their own anger issues as well.
Right. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that.
Mm-hmm.
Letter B, withholding money or the equivalent of money. And do you want me to read this, or would you like to just summarize in the same way?
No, just go ahead and read it. It'd be easier, I think.
This consequence is used frequently in many types of control circumstances. The legal system invokes financial fines, penalties, and judgments when laws or contracts have been broken. Employers reduce benefits, withhold salaries, or terminate jobs altogether when employees violate company policy. Parents refuse allowances or will not buy toys, stereos, or cars when their children disobey the rules. They may withdraw support for college or force an irresponsible adult child from the home for not respecting the needs and rights of the parents. So again, these are ways to use an enforceable consequence.
Yeah, it's one of the options.
Yeah.
Withholding money or the equivalent of money, like you can't live here anymore, type thing, and it can. It's a very viable option. As I've given these indicators, it's a very legitimate option to use as far as negative consequences for not obeying the rules. So it's one of the legitimate ones.
But just to clarify for the listener, there can be the other side of the coin where it can be used as a controlling device, so that person making the rule could withhold money or college funds to get what that person wants, as opposed to a rational need, a rational
Oh, it's an excellent point, Tony. I'm glad you brought that up. For an example, and you use the college fund. I've heard so many people in my practice tell me the resentment that they held toward their parents because and this is very notable primarily from male parents, from fathers. Mm-hmm. They'll say to the child, I went to such and such college, and it was a great experience for me, and I believe in it, and I expect you to go to the same college and pick up where I left off and be a part of the alumni here. We are all loyal to this school, and I will pay for your college in full if you'll do that, but if you go to any other college, I'm not going to pay for it.
Yep.
As soon as no benefit to the child for going to that particular college, it's just for the father's pride or selfish interest or whatever. So that's where you really get a lot of resentment, that there's no good rationale for that. It's just a very selfish, narcissistic rule that one of the parents makes, so they inappropriately withhold money to force the child to go to the college that they want the child to go to. It makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, I had quite a number of friends in music whose fathers did the same thing. Every one of them were fathers, but they did it out of their own thinking process. Well, if you go into music, you're not going to make a good living. I'm not going to support you if you choose that direction. And in their mind, they're thinking rationally, but they're not thinking lovingly and open-minded. Mm-hmm. And so they will say, you need to go into business. You need to go and be a lawyer. You need to go and do this. This will make you money, and then you're going to be set up. I mean, I even know somebody who said, go into plumbing. They make a lot of money. Don't go into opera.
Exactly.
And to them, they think they're making and I'm not going to, they will say, I'm not going to support you. I will not pay for your education if you go into opera or music. They think they're doing something good for them. Mm-hmm. I've had these friends get very confused, try to double major, or they finally just say, fine, I'll give it up and I'll do something else. Or they do choose music and have a $200,000, $300,000 bill at the end of it.
Yeah, and that's an example, I think, of an inappropriate rule to make, but there's a twist on that makes it appropriate, that I think I can give you a good example of. You can make a rule or a requirement to say something like, to say to a child, what you choose to do for a living or career is totally up to you. If you want to go into opera or plumbing or architecture or whatever, that's certainly your business. I want you to follow your dream. I just want you to know that when you become an adult, I'm not going to support you. You're on your own. Now, you're free to choose to make as much or as little money as you want to go into whatever career you want to or not work at all. That's totally up to you. If you want to go on welfare or bum off of other people, that's totally up to you. Just know that when you become an adult, I don't pay the bills anymore, because that would be unhealthy of me to keep you dependent on me to take care of you. So that's responsible parenting, and that's responsible setting of boundaries. It's not telling them what college they have to go to, if at all, or what they need to major in or where they need to make their money. It's just that I'm not going to let you remain a child the rest of your life, which is really good, responsible parenting.
And it needs to be done a lot today because we have more adult children living with their parents.
Oh, yeah.
Than ever.
For that very reason. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's a great way to deal with that issue. All right, C, Withholding affection or attention. Lovers may not be willing to spend time with their mates if they are mistreated or neglected. Parents may not hug their children for a specified time or may refuse to talk with them for a while if they have disobeyed. Even in the workplace, employers and colleagues use social isolation as punishment for unacceptable behavior. And if that sounds harsh, but I can see where there are times, it's, like if you've been abused, don't go, expecting to be hugged, and don't go, fixing things and make everything okay.
And here again, within limits, this is a very acceptable consequence for someone breaking a rule, is that it's going to disrupt, as I indicated earlier in the chapter, the closeness and the intimacy. As a natural consequence, you're not going to feel close to someone who's just been defiant or thrown things around or broken things or had temper tantrums. And a child needs to learn that there are social implications of bad behavior, and they need to learn it early on in life, is that when you act badly, don't expect people to want to be around you for a while. Mm-hmm. There's a natural consequence to it, is that you are disrupting our closeness and our friendship here. And so don't do bad behavior, social bad behavior, and then let's want to kiss and make up very quickly. It damages, at least temporarily, if not permanently, the quality of that relationship. So that's a natural and appropriate consequence, is that you can't act badly and expect people to want to be around you.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, because we've got a lot of irrational people out here, if you are the one doing the isolating or the withholding, make sure it's appropriate to the action that was done.
Oh yeah, a lot of people, they'll have some slight or displeasing type thing, or violating some expectation or rule, and then either the adult partner or the parent or someone doesn't speak to them for 2 weeks.
Yeah,
which is just grossly abusive. It's just to hold a grudge that long and punish someone for something that doesn't require that kind of thing. It's to go back to the old idea that you make the punishment fit the crime.
Right.
Just like the idea of doing so much controversy over long prison sentences for being caught with an ounce of or half ounce of marijuana in your pocket, mm-hmm. and you're sentenced to 7 years in jail.
Yeah.
That's just ridiculous. So that people do the same thing, even with the withholding of affection. That they may not talk to someone for a month. I've known people who wouldn't talk to someone talk to their children or their parents, adult children, for 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Or for life.
Yes.
Because of a slight 20 years ago.
Yes.
It just doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing the grudges that people will hold on to.
Yes.
D, withholding favors. Friends or neighbors use this consequence when they refuse to run errands or provide transportation for someone who has abused the relationship. Bosses may deny requests for time off or not invite an employee to a golf tournament. Parents often say no when a disobedient child asks to be taken to the mall or allowed to spend the night with friends. And that, it's very similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the same thing, is that it is an appropriate consequence as long as it's within reason and not overdone. But it's appropriate when like a child doesn't do his homework. Well, he may not be able to spend the weekend with his buddies, mm-hmm. Which is totally appropriate. Mm-hmm. So that's a legitimate consequence for parents to come up with, or an employer to come up with, or a friend.
And it's so important to start this early and rationally and appropriately with children, so that they realize as they become older and older and older, they learn what consequences mean, and they learn to navigate through them so that they can. It's really about helping them to make good choices.
Oh, absolutely. So the sooner this doing it correctly is used in the home and in the schools and in the business world, moving up and up into the larger society, you're better equipped to function well and expect for rules to be made and enforced, and not expect to be able to get by with bad behavior.
Right. 10. You must be willing to carry out the consequences. You may find this to be the most difficult aspect of rulemaking. Our cultural background tells us that rules are important, but at the same time trains us to feel guilty and mean when we enforce the consequences. In addition, we often will not carry out consequences because we fear the other person's rejection if we do, and this is another big one.
Yes, this is one of the big three in this list of 10, in my experience. The first one is the vagueness that we talked about earlier of the rule itself, and the lack of specificity. You kids behave yourselves while I'm gone. So that's the first difficulty, is being very specific in behavioral terms. And the other one is likened to it, as they say, and that is making the consequences very, very specific. Mm-hmm. Like so many people say, well, you better do what I tell you or you'll wish you had.
Or the one in that we heard so much in the old days was, just wait till your father gets home.
Oh yeah, all this
Okay.
vague type stuff. So that's the second most important one to do correctly, because both of them take work. And then the last one, carry out the consequences. That's the hardest because of the guilt factor. Well, it's really a shame. It's not guilty. If you've already made it clear and it fits the situation, and also the fear of rejection. Well, I don't want to be mean to my kids or carry out the consequence because I'm afraid they might not like me. They get mad at me, and a lot of parents are just old children mm-hmm. who are always seeking approval and liking even from their own children, and so they won't be tough parents when they need to be for that very reason. So these are the big three that are the most difficult ones to do, at least have been from my experience.
And I think there's something that can be said, a lot of people, again, I'll bring this up, hear the word obedience, obey, rules, regulations, consequences. And they think this has to be done with a strong stick, got to be fortified and say it with firmness and kind of, a meanness to it. But this can be done kindly.
No, it'd be done kindly and just matter-of-factly. Mm-hmm. This is the rule. This is the reason for it, that it's good for your growth and development as a social being in the world, and learn how to get along with other people and be respectful and kind to other people. Here again, giving a good rationale for it. If you want to be paid, you have to do the work. Mm-hmm. So a good rule has a good rationale to it that benefits both people, at least in the long run. And then it's just stated, and this is these are the benefits that you will enjoy from following the rules, and these are the negative consequences you need to be aware of. You can't break the rules and expect to get off scot-free, and that's just the way it is. And if you follow the rules, you're going to benefit from it, and I will too. And if you don't follow the rules, you'll have to pay the price for it. and I will carry out the consequences, and I hope this works out for you and me both. So you can just say it very matter-of-factly.
And then when you get to carry out the consequences, you can still stay matter of fact. Well, I see that you chose not to, so this is the consequence.
Yep.
We've discussed it, and here you go.
And then number 11.
Some rules may need to be updated from time to time. With experience, you may occasionally find that you need to alter a rule because of a changed circumstance. At other times, you may decide to cancel a rule entirely if it proves irrational or ineffective. If so, use the experience as a learning opportunity rather than criticizing yourself as a failure at making rules.
So once again, these 11 principles for making rules cleans up the system of functioning well in society, which requires limits, boundaries, rules, regulations, laws. They're very important as long as these principles are followed, and we need to do it non-apologetically, and do it as maturely as possible. And if we do it correctly, it enhances relationships rather than damages them.
Right. Really good information, really good tools. So we'll come back shortly with Chapter 21 on pyrite rules.
Very good.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. Again, Dr. Austin's ebook is available on Amazon Kindle, Barnes & Noble, Scribd, Booktopia, Apple Books, Layman's, and Adlibris. We look forward to having you join us for our next podcast.